Welcome back to another episode of the Brawn Body Health and Fitness Podcast. Joining me for a second time today is Dr. Justin Clifford. Justin and I are going to be diving into the deadlift, in particular, training considerations, accessory exercises, the use of bands and chains, and that sort of thing, and so much more. We do share a hot take or two, such as our opinion on Paul's deadlifts. So this is a great episode, a lot of great content and insight, and I really think this is going to help you, whether you're a strength coach, a PT, or someone who just wants to get better at deadlifting. I think there's a lot of great information to help you out here. This episode and every episode in season 5 is sponsored by Isophit. For more on Isophit, you can check the description below. Enjoy. Justin, welcome back to the podcast. I'm super excited to bring you back on. Thank you so much for being here, man.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. It's a good time. It's a good time last time. I'm sure we'll enjoy ourselves today too.
Always. For people who might not have caught that first part where we reviewed deadlift principles and theory and so many considerations around the deadlift, I highly recommend they go back and listen to it. But if they haven't heard from you yet, would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are and all the great things that you do?
Yeah, so I'm a physical therapist. Worked in the human performance setting for coming up on 7 years now. I work primarily with military and tactical populations. So, with that caveat comes the fact that because I work for the government, nothing that I'm saying right now represents government policy or endorsement or anything like that. All of this is just my own opinion. Okay. But within that background, I'm board certified in sports and orthopedic PT. I'm a certified strength and conditioning specialist. Been competing in strength sports since 2009 across powerlifting, strongman, Highland Games, arm lifting or grip strength stuff, and just random general, feats of strength. Worked as a massage therapist for about 8 years before I became a PT. Discovered the gospel of strength training during that time, and that led me into actually becoming a physical therapist. Started my own strength training in order to be able to throw people better in judo and jujitsu, and that led down this road. And so here I am picking up heavy crap all the time, and
That's absolutely amazing.
Spreading the word on that. So.
Yeah, and I have to say that your legacy certainly precedes you. I've heard so many great things about you from so many people in the strongman space, from Greg to Jeff and so many other individuals. And it seems like anytime your name comes up, the concept of deadlifting comes up. And I think this is an area we really need to learn more about from a PT, rehab, and even strength and conditioning standpoint. The deadlift is fundamental to everyday life, in my opinion. How often do we pick something up off the ground and move it from one place to another, right? Like, this is strength for life, for lack of a better way to put it. And yet, for some reason, I see a lot of errors or misconceptions surrounding the deadlift. And, thinking back to our conversation on the podcast in the past and a podcast with Rob Butler that we did, I think a lot of it comes from a lack of common knowledge and understanding and common terminology around what we call things. So when I say the term deadlift, what exactly does that mean for you? What does the term deadlift constitute?
And so for me, the definition is very, very broad. It's just picking something up, right? It's picking something up from below your center of mass. Any type of lift that involves that in some fashion is going to have common principles with what we think of as the barbell deadlift, right? And that's where people, I think, sometimes get hung up, is they get caught up in, hey, barbell deadlift, this is very heavy, people slam weights, this is scary, right? I don't want to hurt my back, etc. And they ignore the fact that they bend over and pick stuff up all the time, right? Or, picking up a laundry basket is a deadlift, right? Picking up the groceries, even if it's out of the back of your car, is a deadlift. From a strongman or a functional training standpoint, picking up a sandbag from the ground or an Atlas stone is a deadlift with a varied grip, right? All of these require bending over, hinging at the hips, getting the trunk engaged, and transferring the load from the hands to the ground to attain an erect posture. That is a deadlift.
And I've noticed that people do it in a lot of different ways, right? Like, there's not like one universal, this is the way you have to deadlift, right? Like, people end up adopting a variety of different stances, different positions. And sometimes the way we lift things up varies based on what we're lifting, right? Like,
100%.
I might lift a stone different than I lift a barbell, for example.
Yes, for sure. And the way we lift is going to be governed mostly by our constraints, right? So if I am picking up a heavy sandbag or something of that sort, the center of mass is probably going to be a little bit further out in front of me. I'm going to have to get myself a little bit lower. Whereas if I'm picking up a barbell, I can get a lot closer to that center of mass, and it's at a fixed height from the ground typically, right? So like a standard plate is like 450 millimeters in diameter. So it's going to be half of that from the ground. And that's what we use in like strongman and powerlifting competitions. Strongman sometimes will do, varied heights or whatever. But what we think of as like deadlift technique oftentimes comes about from those strength disciplines, right? From a powerlifting standpoint, which is fine, right? Within the context of powerlifting, the techniques that are described there, where you're getting maximal bracing, wedging yourself into the bar, and really trying to actually make the lift as efficient as possible. It's a great place to start, because it teaches you how to be efficient within a range that is very standardized and accessible, right? Barbells are ubiquitous. They're pretty much all the same. Yeah, there's some differences with the specialty bars, but you go to a Gold's Gym, in LA, and you go to a base gym in Dubai, and the bars are going to behave almost the same, right? You're going to be able to train them very similarly. And so that's a great starting point. But at the same time, if I'm training, say, a tactical, working with the tactical population, and they need to do, evacuation of a casualty, that person is on a litter, that's going to look different, right? But they're still going to have to deadlift that up, and they're going to have to do it maybe with a partner on the other end and coordinate that lift. The last thing I want them thinking about in that circumstance is, oh, I got to make sure my lats are tight. Got to do my pre deadlift routine. You've seen this if you watch Instagram. You see people do this weird like little dance or whatever as they brace before a big lift on the platform. You don't want to be doing that kind of stuff under fire, and you don't want to have to think about that if you're doing the laundry or picking up your kid. So it's a starting point, using the barbell and training up that maximum efficiency and that heavy bracing that we do for that. But that's not the be all end all of training the deadlift. And that's not the ends for most people, unless they're actually competing in strength sports. The deadlift is a means to an end. It is a way to get general strengthening, general training, general physical preparation that then applies to whatever they need to do in their daily life.
Yeah, I love that you brought that up, and I love your point on the Instagram side of things, the cueing, that sort of thing, because as you said, we've all seen it, and I think the term like corrective exercise gets thrown out in the whole deadlift world all the time, and it's like, how can we call it a corrective exercise when there's really not one correct way to deadlift? Plain and simple. If I see someone deadlifting with a little bit more lumbar flexion, then maybe that's just how they've kind of done things for quite some time, right? Or maybe they're used to picking up something like a sandbag, where, as you mentioned, they need to get a little bit lower to the ground, and eventually that spine is going to flex. I personally think that a little bit of lumbar flexion is almost essential in like every deadlift pattern. Very rarely do we see like someone maintain a like extended position when they sink down that low like that. So I think the term corrective exercise gets thrown around too often around the deadlift, and a lot of times we need to just kind of simplify and accept the fact that as long as someone is safe doing what they're doing and it's working well for them, that I might be better off just not touching it in the first place.
Yeah, the way I approach that is, if I was coaching somebody up on running, right, and somebody came to me with lower extremity pain, and I was instructing them to run, what I would not do is sit down and talk them through every phase of the gait cycle, what one leg and the upper body are doing opposite each other. You're not gonna do that. You're gonna say, hey, let me see your run. Because the body we are very good at self-organizing our movements, and it's the constraints that are placed on us by the environment or by the rules of if we're doing competition. That's what's going to determine the methods that we use. And so let the person kind of figure it out a little bit and then work from there. Now, I will say, from a competition standpoint, there are definitely more efficient ways of getting things done. And that's still going to vary from person to person, because everybody's anatomy and training history are different, right? If I'm competing in powerlifting and I'm, trying to intentionally train a rounded back deadlift because I feel like, hey, it gets demonized or whatever, maybe it shortens the range of motion a little bit. For me, it doesn't. But I'm not necessarily going to go that way just because, it's probably fine. I'm probably going to teach that person to brace and stay more rigid so that they can lift maximum weight, because that's the goal of powerlifting, right? Whereas if I have somebody who, they don't care what their barbell deadlift ends up being, we might still use the barbell to train them, but I'm going to introduce movement variability. I'm going to have them lift all sorts of different things and just let them do it, and use that almost more like a graded exposure type treatment, where they gain the confidence in their body to actually do stuff. Yeah, there's not necessarily a 100% correct way. Like, nobody lives their life in a neutral position all the time. Your best posture is your next one. Even things like running, like torso rotation, and which is flexion on one side and extension on the other. Like, we're meant to move. We're meant to move.
We are meant to move. And as we said, plain and simple, everyone approaches the deadlift a little bit differently, and that's okay. How do we get someone prepped and ready to deadlift as far as like the warm up goes, when we understand that it can be very different between one person and the next, and even the circumstances can vary a lot too, I think, right? Like, I might approach warm up for a deadlift training session in the gym a lot different than I approach warm up for deadlift in competition, or depending on the type of deadlift I'm doing. How do we go about like warming someone up and prepping them to get ready for that lift, especially if we're going to try and avoid some of those corrective type things that we talked about earlier?
It's definitely going to depend on the person in front of you every single time, right? So, once we establish, okay, they're ready to do some kind of hinge movement, and they can do that with body weight, they can bend forward and touch their toes and it's not painful. Okay, we'll start loading that up. I'll, point to a kettlebell across the room and say, okay, go pick that up and let me see some RDLs. First of all, I want to see how they pick it up and move it into position to do the RDLs, right? That's part of the assessment for me. The kettlebell is just handy because I don't have to load plates on it. It's typically a 45-pound bell, so it's the same weight as an empty bar. And if that goes okay, it's like, all right, let's step out and let's go out into the gym. We'll load some plates on the bar, ask them what they want to start with, ask them what their typical working weight is. If there's a certain weight or point of fatigue where they start to experience symptoms, we'll just slowly work up to that just using the regular deadlift. If I'm going to be treating this more like a training type session, and I'm working with somebody who doesn't necessarily have pain, but there's this particular like sticking point or something else that we're working into, I'm going to have them do a little bit more of a dynamic warm up. I'm going to have them, get the core temperature up in some fashion or another. I'm going to have them do some fast extension type movements. I'm a huge fan of doing very fast front squats, or you could even do that like with a goblet squat or something like that. You could superset that with a heavy kettlebell swing, and really more like the Russian style, where you're just exploding from the hips and then trying to stop the bell once you reach full extension at the hips. Doing that kind of stuff just to kind of get the body primed up to lift, and then we'll go look at the barbell. If the barbell is moving fine, we just progressively add weight from that. For some people, if the hinge with body weight is, it's okay, but as soon as we add weight, they start to have problems. Then what I'll start to do is kind of distract where we put the weight. So rather than starting them out with a barbell in front of them, again, that can be kind of scary and intimidating, and some people will kind of reflexively brace and bristle, right? I might hand them a kettlebell and I'll say, okay, put it behind your back. And the arms are holding the trunk steady, right? The arms are holding the trunk in extension for them. They're not having to think about it. It's like, okay, now just kind of reach your butt back and try to touch the kettlebell to the wall with your butt. Oh, hey, look, there's a loaded hinge, right? And meanwhile, the trunk is staying nice and straight for us. Okay, now we grease that groove a little bit. Let's bring the weight out in front of you. Let's try to keep that same trunk position. Engage your lats now, instead of using your arms passively to keep the trunk extended, and we can usually progress up from there. And then from there, it's just more a matter of what do we have? What are we trying to train that day?
Yeah, no, exactly. And I love you bringing up the front squat. I know that was something that you mentioned in our first episode as like one of your go-to accessory lifts for the deadlift.
Yep.
And we'll get into that more. But I like the concept of the front squat. I like the concept of the kettlebell swing a lot in preparation to deadlift. And I like the specificity of those as well, right? Like, we're not just gonna like throw a little like glute loop band at someone and say this will prep you to deadlift like 600 pounds, when we aren't even hitting the movement pattern that we're going to be training. And I also think that adding in a squat and swing, kind of like you proposed there, it's a little bit more than just grabbing the bar empty and starting to deadlift. It's a
Yep.
little bit more than just like, well, I'm going to warm up for deadlift by deadlifting. I think that there's a little bit more to it. And I think this is an area too, where you mentioned before about sticking points, or we talked about it before. This could be an area where you kind of like fine tune that sticking point a little bit. So take that kettlebell
Mhm.
swing. If your sticking point is the bottom part, then maybe dead stop kettlebell swing each time.
Yep.
If your sticking point is up top, then maybe use a little momentum down low and really hammer the top part of the swing to dead stop. So I
Yep.
certainly like that kind of approach to the warm up. And as you mentioned, it's also going to vary a little bit based on our training goal for that day. I've seen a lot of different variability here as well. There's some people I know who only deadlift once a week in a training sense, and I've seen others who deadlift 2 or 3 times a week in a training sense. They just kind of hit altered intensity, or maybe they hit different variables or that sort of thing that way. How do you go about, based on, different goals that people come to you with, powerlifting or strongman or that sort of thing? How do you go about approaching the training side and programming side for the deadlift?
So I think for that it depends. So if it's powerlifting, that's pretty clear cut, right? You've got your three big lifts that you've got to do in the competition, and I'm going to look at kind of their training history. Are they accustomed to doing just squat bench dead days like 3 days a week? Some people do that. If they're running Shiko, are they doing some kind of deadlift, squat, and bench variation almost daily? Like that kind of stuff matters. But for strongman, that's where we look at, okay, what events are we preparing for, and how specific do we want to be with our training, right? So for example, if I've got an elevated axle bar deadlift for reps, right, as one of the strongman events, and then there's a sandbag loading medley or something like that, right? I'm just spitting stuff out. Those are both deadlift-esque patterns, right? So we still need to pick some heavy stuff up off the floor, but they're different enough from the barbell deadlift that I can probably get away with having a day that is focused mostly on building strength on the deadlift itself and just train more traditional barbell type stuff. Maybe probably going to use a stiff bar instead of the axle, or instead of a noodly deadlift bar. And I'm going to train that up, and that's going to look more like traditional strength training. It might not look like a powerlifting type session where we're hitting certain percentages, but we're trying to exert a lot of force and get some high effort sets in within a moderate to low rep range. If I'm worried about doing reps for time, I might increase that rep range. Maybe I dictate those sets with that straight bar based on time rather than the number of reps accomplished. And then on a separate day, I might train the actual events, right? I might start with the sandbag from the floor because that demands the most range of motion, and I want to kind of be fresher for that. It's kind of a nice little like almost problem solving type warm up. I'm a fan of kind of problem solving lifts, and get that going, and then transition that into training the axle dead, and then if that's a max reps for in like 60 seconds or something like that. Okay, let's do 3 sets of 60 seconds, and first set will be kind of a less than working or comp weight. Last 2 sets might be at or above comp weight, depending on where your capabilities are and where you are in the training cycle. I have done for powerlifting, I have deadlifted as heavy as often as 5 days a week in preparation for meets, and I think there's some utility to that. I think you get some diminishing returns if the intensity stays too high across the board. You cut into your ability to recover. But if the pattern is important, you can get away with training it in some fashion every day, right? If we change context completely, like we look at, I got a chance to look over some of the strength programs that they use for the astronauts up on the ISS using the ARED platform that they have up there, and I mean they do like at least one, oftentimes 2 deadlift variations every day up on that platform up there, mostly to build bone mass and maintain muscle strength, right? And so the goals are going to dictate that a lot, as well as training history. So
Yeah. Ultimately, catering what you're going to program from a deadlift to the goal and the training history that way. I like that a lot. Because to that point, some people really just want to lift heavy, and that's more
Mhm.
what I see the powerlifting side, or really intro to strongman as well, right? Like you look at a lot of the weights they're using for a lot of these events, and if you don't have the capacity to move the weight, then we need to build you a bigger engine first, for lack of a better way to put it. So I
Yes.
certainly see a lot of value in that, and from the training history standpoint as well, I think that this, going back a little bit, the background that someone has from a training standpoint is probably going to dictate how they approach the deadlift initially, right? Like, so understanding how all of those things go into and play into the makeup of the person that you're trying to work with here. And ultimately, I think it's a match of where they've been and where they need to go. And to that point as well, I think a lot of different like personal factors, like the kind of person you're working with, really go into this as well, right? Like maybe someone only has time to train 3 or 4 days a week. Well,
If
then
that.
it's not realistic to deadlift 6 times a week if I can't even get them in the gym more than four.
Right.
So understanding like the personal factors as well, because you could have the perfect program written out for someone on paper, and then it never comes to fruition because you neglected the personal side of it, for lack of a better way to put it.
Yeah. And even in circumstances like that, something is always better than nothing, right? And we know from the research that's recently come out, like you can still make gains with a single hard set per week, right? You go into the gym, you do one hard set, you exert yourself hard, you can still continue to make gains on that. Now, if you're a high level athlete and you've gotten up to, you've peaked into a program where you're, deadlifting heavy or otherwise lifting heavy, 5 days a week, and you drop down to one time a week, that might be a little bit different for you, right? But for Gen Pop and for most purposes, you can check the box by going in and working hard for a single heavy set on a given exercise. Deadlift and squat, those things, they use a ton of muscle, and so it's very good bang for the buck to just knock that out, rather than worrying about how many accessory lifts or whatever do I need to go. It's tremendous training economy in order to be able to just go in and just bang out a quick set of deadlifts and move on.
Yeah, definitely. So our minimum effective dose is at least one heavy set per week. And when you say heavy set, we're talking like very high 1 rep max or high intensity levels here.
Yeah, I mean, I typically wouldn't recommend like, okay, I'm going to go to the gym, I'm going to max out my deadlift, try to pull a heavy single, and then go home. Pick a weight that that you can lift. Just make it hard by doing more reps, right? So,
Yep.
what I would typically do is like, okay, that you can, you can lift a certain weight on your worst day. Okay, go pick it up and do reps until it feels sloppy, and then stop. Right. So, that might end up being a heavy single. That if stuff is feeling dodgy, maybe that's what you do. And at that point, maybe it's wise to just take a plate off and bust out another drop set right there. But it might be up to like 8 or 9 reps, 10 reps, depending on how you're feeling that day. So the important part is that you just reach a high level of effort by the end of the set, so you get that minimum stimulus in there.
Yeah, definitely. So we need to hit the minimum stimulus. Outside of that approach, is there any like go-to numbers or ratios or anything like that you look for from like a sets, reps, intensity, volume type consideration for programming here in order to continue to elicit strength gain?
I mean, I ballpark it honestly. Unless I've got a very precise map planned out for a patient or a trainee. Like I'm not gonna get down into the weeds of the exact number of sets and reps that they do. I think if you hit 3 to 5 quality sets and you're reaching a high level of effort behind that, you do that maybe twice a week, you're going to get a lot of good adaptation. You're going to get a lot of good stimulus out of that. You would vary that again based on, okay, is my target to be able to do deadlift for reps, max reps in a minute? Am I really going for that 1 rep max? And then you got to be thinking about how you're peaking and all that stuff. So I don't overcomplicate it. You can check the box a lot of different ways. When you're deadlifting for deadlifting's sake, right? You're trying to get that 1 rep max for the strongman comp or for the powerlifting comp. That's where you need to be a little bit more strategic, but also recognize that your performance is going to vary day to day based on more things than what you're doing in the gym. And so you need to have some flexibility built into your program. Otherwise, it's very easy to get off the rails and screw up the competition preparation. So be kind to yourself, I think is one way to look at that. or just at least appreciate the factors, the chaos that brings to that, how chaos factors into your training.
Yeah, yeah. Understanding that there is a time and a place to push forward and push through, and then there's a time and a place to kind of let off the gas a little bit ultimately in
Yep.
the training.
Yep.
And I think that's very well, or I think we can understand that in relation to the deadlift. And one of my favorite ways for my own training to kind of back off the intensity, if I'm down bad and I'm just feeling real beat up and I just am not in the state to push heavy that day in the deadlift, is I usually push my accessories a little bit harder
Mm-hmm.
because my accessories might, facilitate gain or improvement in those muscle groups and patterns, but they might be in a slightly less, nervous system demanding way or more isolated way or what have you that way. When it
Yep.
comes to accessories for the deadlift, what ones are your go-tos, and what there's so many considerations we can get into with accessories, but I guess I'll start with, what kind of things do you typically reach for yourself in your own training or for training clients?
For my own training, we mentioned front squats already. I'm a huge fan of front squats. I really like heavy front squats with chains. Um, Getting to, and usually using like a cambered bar or something like that, just so I'm not having to worry about like the strict roll of the barbell. I don't love using bands with the front squat just because it feels a little bit dodgier. It can be done. I've done it recently. It's okay, but chains are much preferred. Something in the 400-pound range on the bar with 100 to 160 pounds of chain, and just obviously loading that chain so that it's entirely on the ground at the bottom of the rep and just barely touching the ground at the top, just so it's not swinging. I feel like the upper back bracing that I have to get with those really carries over into the deadlift very well. I also am a big fan of doing deadlifts against bands. I've done that for years, and I've found nothing but good things coming from it. It's very versatile. Even in those cases where I am feeling pretty beat up, I can throw bands on the bar and pull at a lighter weight off the floor, and the weight is heavier at the top because the bands get stretched out, and that allows me to still get a very aggressive stimulus even in those sessions where I'm feeling beat up. Or if I'm trying to translate that into something that's more explosive, like a weight over bar throw for Highland games, the bands are a great accessory to drill that as well when available. And I don't have easy access to these all the time. I'm also a big fan of either like a reverse hyper or a 45-degree back raise, just something that doesn't provide, I don't have any compressive load on the spine because I'm not like wedging myself between the bar and the ground. But I can still get a really good pump out of the low back muscles and the glutes at the same time. Just feels really therapeutic just to get a good pump in there after a heavy session. Additionally, any kind of like unilateral ab work, and I use that very broadly. Like a single arm TRX row, right, where you're moving in a heavy plank. You're moving in a plank while rowing your body weight. Throw a weight vest on if you want some extra difficulty, or swing further underneath the bar. So you get kind of that anti-rotation piece while still training the lat. Side planks for max effort, kind of almost like a hard style front plank, but in a side plank position, really trying to get the obliques and that QL and the glute on the down leg all working very hard together at a very high level of contraction for a short period. That tends to feel pretty good as well. Honestly, for my own accessory stuff, that's about it. I will throw in, and I honestly need to do more and more of these, especially because I don't have good access to reverse hypers or 45-degree back races. But the single leg RDL on a landmine, because for one thing, the single leg RDL is just such a high yield movement to train up the glutes, train up the anti-rotation piece, especially if you want to stand with your inside hand grabbing the weight, outside hand is supporting your body, and so you get a little bit of that. A little bit of support from right shoulder to left leg driving down that way. But when you use the landmine, you can kind of push into the anchor a little bit, so balance is not an issue, or at least much less of an issue. So you can load those up heavy. Instead of sitting there and doing that with like a 35-pound kettlebell, you load up 3 plates on that landmine and bust out a few sets of 10 reps or something like that. That's nice and juicy.
Yeah.
That's a really good one.
Definitely. I love a lot of the things you brought up, Justin, and there's certainly a lot to unpack there. First off, I think considering the use of chains and bands in the lifting is very unique. You brought up both of those and how, with the front squat, it seems like you have a preference for the chains over the bands. I think a lot of strength coaches, PTs, I don't think a lot of them have access to that kind of equipment like chains. Like we don't
It's
have,
pretty niche.
yeah, we don't have hundreds of pounds of chains laying around the clinic, for example. So I think understanding when to reach for those and what that's going to provide, and how the chain differs from the band is absolutely essential. So
Yeah, so they're both gonna you're still gonna get accommodating resistance with both of them, and it's always gonna depend on the setup. I think for the deadlift in particular, chains are just awkward
mhm,
for the deadlift because either you're putting them on the ends of the bar and then the chain can pile up underneath the plates. You can damage your plates, you can damage your floor, you can damage your chains, or worse off, like the chains make the bar bounce off at an angle, and then you take a bar to the shin with heavy weight, or it pulls you out of position. They're just awkward. If you put them across the middle of the bar, like some people do, um, that will sometimes push the bar further away from you at lockout, or it'll push against your pubic bone, which can be painful. So you might not push through to lockout quite as explosively as you might otherwise. You can use like a strap or something like that to help set that up. But for the most part, yeah, like just get some bands, and you've got a couple of different ways to set them up. One that's very, very portable is to get like some short band loops. I know Elite FTS sells them. There are probably some other retailers that sell them. They're I want to say about 16 inches long and very thick. And so you can get, for me, like the at my height, the green Monster Mini loops from Elite FTS add about 45 pounds per band, right? So I stand on a pair of those and they just loop them over the bar. And, you know, I try to wear long pants just so I don't rip the hair out of my legs with the rubber. But standing on those, like, it's basically like the difference of one whole plate off the floor versus lockout. It's one plate heavier at lockout for me. The orange ones are a little bit more than that. The red ones are a little bit less than that. And I have some of their gray ones that are quite a bit more. But you get much thicker than like if you get the bands much thicker than like an inch and a half. The weight, the resistance on those bands just interferes with your stance too much because you're standing on those bands to support them, and that changes how you drive into the floor a little bit. You can use longer bands stretched out over the shaft of the bar or over the sleeves, anchored usually on like hooks on like a deadlift platform, or sometimes like on band pegs inside of a rack or something like that. And that can be really, really good because you don't have to worry about your stance changing. You don't have to worry about the bands rubbing against your legs or something like that. All of those setups work very, very well. The ladder setup where you have the bands set up um, in a rack or on a platform also works very, very well for a deficit deadlift. So using bands on a deficit deadlift that just feels good. There's not really another way to describe that, right? People love or hate deficit deadlifts. Universally, like the deficit deadlift is harder off the floor. But if I wanted to train a longer range of motion, especially if I'm training weight over bar for Highland games, I want as long of a push off the floor as I can get. So I might stand on a 2 or 3 inch box, put a crap ton of band tension on there, and do a couple quick doubles and then move straight into a throw. And now I'm training up that long pull and push from the legs to throw that weight overhead. And that just feels like it's just a great drill. Great drill. Chains on the deadlift though, yeah, I'm not a huge fan. Chains, I will say for bench, the range of motion is such that like using bands or reverse bands feels okay. I still prefer chains when I can access them, just because I feel like they're more consistent. The one thing about bands is that they're always going to pull towards the anchor, right? And that anchor might not be straight down, or if you're using a reverse band setup, it might not always be straight up. So if your setup is a little bit different, like that band can actually pull you at a little bit different angle, and that might throw you off. Might just also change how you train your balance, and that can potentially have impacts on carryover for whatever you're doing those lifts. Chains, however, are always going to pull straight down, unless you're swinging, and they shouldn't be swinging. They're always going to pull straight down. You walk out the bar, the chains are going to pull straight down, no matter how far out you walk that bar. right? If you take a slightly bigger step, it's still going to pull straight down. And so for squat and for bench, I feel like chains are just a little bit friendlier, but yeah, not as accessible as the bands. So the bands can be really beneficial there. Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of reverse bands for the most part, just because the way it offloads the weight makes it harder to know how much weight you're actually moving at the top of the rep, unless you prefer to know the exact weight and then you have the bands coming completely off or what have you. I find that it's a little bit more. I feel like I get a little bit more pop if I'm using the bands off, anchored below me, anchored on the floor or under my feet. And from a rehab standpoint, using the bands on the deadlift in particular is just fantastic, because it very, very often, right? We talk about with rehab, and if we're modifying lifts, we talk about changing the range of motion. We manipulate the load, manipulate degrees of freedom, whatever else. And one of the first things people do is they reduce range of motion, because while people might be able to handle full range of motion with light weights, heavier weights make it harder or make it more painful, right? So if somebody's got some lower lumbar or some SI stuff, and deadlifting from the floor above a certain percentage of their max is painful, say they can pull 315 off the ground without any issues, but they don't really feel like they're working hard until they're pulling 405, but 400 feels very painful off the floor or is very fatiguing to them. Okay, well, put 315 on the bar, then put bands on it. Now I can pull a weight that I'm comfortable and knowledgeable, but and there's that confidence, right, that you can pull that weight off the floor, but also mechanically it's less strenuous, but I can still get that weight at the top. And now I can train not just you're kind of modifying the load through the range of motion rather than training a completely different range of motion or underloading them. It's a great compromise to get you right into that spot where you can train the patient right at the edge of what they can handle without pissing stuff off too much. So the bands on the deadlift in the clinic, I think, are hugely underutilized. I think that could be done. I think a lot more patients could benefit from that.
Yeah, no, I completely echo that point. And if there's one thing PTs tend to have, it is bands, of course. Oddly enough.
No, the wrong kind of band. Theraband isn't going to cut it.
Yeah, no. But I think those are great points and great utilization standpoint things as well there. I definitely like the incorporation of the bands. And I think that you can get a lot of creativity here as well, right? So you mentioned that where you anchor the band is going to change what you feel during the lift. So you mentioned standing on the band. I've also seen people kind of like loop a band over top the bar on the end of where their plates are and anchor on the side there. So they've got one band on each side. Like, you can get a little bit creative here. I also think this is an area where you can play around on the programming side of things with a lighter band and a lighter weight. If you want to hit more of like a speed type of component here, you could play around with lighter weight, heavier band, heavier weight, lighter band. You can get really creative in what you do here and find what works for you. And ultimately, I think that's the most important piece of this is, what works for you might not work for the next person. So understanding the principle behind where a band would be applied to a deadlift and then how to adjust it based on the person you're working with.
Yes. Anytime you're working with an athlete or with a patient or with yourself, like if you don't have a clear reason for an exercise that you're performing, you need to rethink your methods. You need to have an intent behind that exercise. And it might simply be, hey, I want to check the box on the deadlift and move on. Okay, that's a reason, right? It doesn't have to be as crazy specific as, hey, I'm going to use these bands, but I'm going to keep the bar weight such that, I'm maintaining above 0.9 meters per second velocity at the, mid-range of the rep or whatever. You don't have to get that fancy with it unless you want to, right? If you have reason to do that, you can. Just have a reason, right? Don't just go in there and do a bunch of random crap because you saw it on Instagram and you thought it looked cool. You can do that. If your reason is, hey, I saw this on Instagram and I want to experiment with it so that maybe I can use it later. That's a good reason, right? Just going in and doing random crap without thinking it through. Be intentional,
Always. And speaking of intentional, you mentioned one of your other go-to accessories is the single leg RDL with a landmine. And I think that is one of my favorite accessory movements. And that's one that I do program a lot from a strength and performance standpoint, but also from a rehabilitation standpoint. But at least for myself, I'll program it differently. So I modify the load. Sometimes from a rehab standpoint, I want different variabilities added into that movement. So we might actually do a lighter single leg RDL and incorporate a little bit more of like a overhead reach at the top. There's a lot
Yep.
of different incorporations that you can hit with that single leg RDL, but I'm a huge proponent of the landmine single leg RDL as a good accessory for the deadlift. And I think, as you mentioned, it really hammers good posterior chain loading, but it really hits the ability to transfer that through the lat as
Yes.
well. And I think
Yep.
that's something, at least for myself, I have always struggled with that concept of transferring power from lower extremity to upper extremity and vice versa.
Yeah, I think that's something that we inherently do a little bit better with pushing. If you think about throwing a punch, that back leg, if I'm throwing a punch, that back leg is going to be pushing off with that. With running, right, we're going to advance the opposite arm, opposite leg. Pulling, or more of like a vertical load into the ground or a hinge, it's a little bit less intuitive, but the motor patterns are compatible enough that it still works pretty dang well, and it works in a way that transfers over into a lot of the other things that we want our athletes or our patients to be doing. Plus, it just hits a lot of stuff really, really well. It lets you get solid loading on a lot of things without having limiting factors in balance or even grip strength, right? Because it's not going to roll on you the same. And if it is, you can use a strap, or you can use some handle attachment on the end of your landmine or whatever. And it's very accessible too, right? If you have a barbell and you have some plates, like you can get a little landmine attachment for, some people will charge like over $100 for them, but you can get them for as little as $30 on Amazon. Like, it's not, a highly specialized piece of equipment. You can cut a tennis ball and shove the end of the barbell into the tennis ball and put it in the corner of a room, and it'll still work. I've had people do it with a PVC pipe, even just put the PVC pipe in the corner of a room just so that they have a little bit of that balance point, rather than using their hand to push off of something. The standard regression for a single leg hinge, if you don't add weight to it, you just want somebody to be able to perform it, is to put their hand on like a countertop or on the wall or something. Well, they could push off of that to assist. You just put a PVC pipe in the corner and make them hold on to the end of the PVC pipe. They've got to push out to the side, and that's not going to help them stand up straight quite as much, but it'll reduce the balance challenge. But now I can add weight to it, and I can load through the glute, I can load through the obliques, through the lats, and get a lot of really good stuff.
Yeah, definitely. So we mentioned deadlift, single leg RDL, we're a fan of. You mentioned reverse hyper and 45-degree hyper as well. I echo that point. I gotta say, I think the reverse hyper has been the best isolated contraction I feel in my posterior chain,
Yeah.
personally. But I noticed the good morning never came up. And this is an exercise I see often debated. Some people love the
Yeah.
good morning, and others are like steering clear of it entirely. Where do you see something like a axial loaded hinge version like that good morning coming in? And does that vary at all based on the equipment used? Does like a cambered bar or a SSB change what we're getting from a good morning type movement?
Honestly, like, I don't program them for the people that I work with unless they have an upper extremity limitation, in which case I'm using a safety squat bar. So the only times I would and this is my bias, but like, I know we saw a lot more good mornings back in the days when like equipped powerlifting was the dominant form of the sport, and it was a both a max effort and a dynamic effort variation used at Westside. Like, there's some good utility to that, but I feel like just the axial load of just adding some additional hinge on top of that, like, it just doesn't give as much bang for the buck as doing any other thing where I've got the weight in my hands and I'm doing a hinge, right? Even if I'm like lifting a sandbag, like, I prefer that kind of stuff to actually like a barbell good morning. However, if I have somebody who can't hold on to something for whatever reason, they might even, be post-op shoulder or something like that, and they're sitting there in a sling, I can put a safety squat bar on their back, have them hold on to it with their good hand, and now we can train the hinge that way, right? We can train, we can load that up as much or as little as we want, but typically I'm going to be doing that with some kind of safety squat bar, and that's going to be done out of the rack, and it's going to be attended, right? Because obviously, like, I'm going to have to help them put weights on the bar, or somebody's going to have to help them put weights on the bar that way. I've seen that also done with like chains and bands and stuff like that. That just seems like a really weird, awkward setup. Chains I can see working because it's always going to pull straight down, but bands, like, that's just going to pull you in weird ways. Like it's just, the juice isn't worth the squeeze as far as that goes. So I mean, it can be good. I just think, like, I just would rather do like a reverse hyper. If I wanted to get extra volume on my low back, I'm going to do that in a way that just doesn't add fatigue in that axially loaded position. But I think they can be used. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with them. Just not that useful if you're able to actually do other deadlift stuff.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And it's funny because how you feel about the good morning has been how I felt about the I think they call it like the kickstand or the split stance deadlift variations. So not single leg, but not straight double leg, more of like one foot in front of the other. Originally I used to use them a lot more, and lately I've kind of gotten away from them quite a bit because I felt like what I was seeing from a like training stimulus, like what I was getting from it wasn't really what I wanted, right? Like I can put
Yeah.
someone in a Bulgarian split squat position and go through that same hinge pattern, but 30 pounds of weight crushes them. It's like, if I'm training someone to deadlift 600 or 700 pounds, then a 30-pound lift probably is not giving us the stimulus that we need in order to improve that in any capacity.
Right. And for the kickstand lift, like I'm never going to really train that very heavy, honestly. If I use it at all, I'm going to use it as a warm up, and I'm going to do it walking, right? Like, think of like a walking lunge, except it's a walking hinge. You can add weight to it, right? But it's going to be one of those things where I'm just loosening things up and getting you a quick pump before we go and do some of the bigger lifts. I'm not going to do it as a conditioning workout. It's really just getting stuff warmed up. I will say there is some utility in training it, especially with like a trap bar type grip. If you do have people who are going to be doing like litter carries or something like that, right? So it's like tactical setting, and you've got to pick up litters which have side handles. They're usually much lower to the ground, and your ability to get down and into a proper hinge with all of your kit on you might be a little bit more challenging. So that's going to look kind of like a hybrid lunge, kickstand, deadlift kind of thing. I just want to make sure that movement pattern is familiar enough that they're not having to think about it, right? If they're trying to pick somebody up and move them under fire.
Yeah, no, that's a great point in the tactical setting. And on that tactical setting as well, when I've worked with some individuals in the military in the past, all of them have kind of shared with me that one of their go-to things, at least in their own training, was they love the tire flip, which was an interesting one because, yeah, we have a deadlift of a odd object, but I guess I never really saw that as much from a like powerlifting strongman sense, unless your event is, tire flipping, I guess, in the strongman competition.
Yeah.
It looks cool though. It looks
Yeah,
really
it looks
cool.
it looks cool. It feels cool. You get this this big tire, you're flipping it over, and it feels like a badass thing. You're not having to go through a bunch of wood to chop, or whatever. I don't know. I have mixed feelings about it. I think most of the tires that I see people flipping where I work, the tires are too short and they're too light, and so like it doesn't really encourage like good mechanics, and it's too slow to really be good conditioning. I mean, it's kind of fun, it's odd object stuff. If you're doing it as part of like a team drill, right, where you got to flip it back and forth or down a course, and then your team has got to do some other stuff, that can be kind of fun. But as like a training movement, kind of overrated. Unless, again, if you're competing in strongman and your event is the tire flip, you need to make sure that you're using an appropriate tire that you can use good technique on, and it should look more like a 3-point stance on a football field than it should look like a sumo deadlift, right? You should be able to drive forward through that tire to lift it up. I think Callie Beck and some others have done really good videos on just like simple corrections of tire flipping form. But if their tire is too short, you can't use that good technique, and you end up just kind of doing the weird like pooping dog sumo deadlift, double bicep curl lift, which it's just kind of gross. It's just kind of a gross lift.
It's funny because I found different times people end up in that weird kind of position if they have a sticking point in their lift as well, and they're just trying to like do anything they can to push through it. So for example, I struggle to get weight off the floor. Once I get the bar above my knees, my lockout is usually pretty straightforward, but I struggle in the first half of the rep. And I've looked back to some different videos and I found my body moves in weird ways to try and generate more tension and get a bar off the ground sometimes. So
Yeah.
how do you go about adjusting the accessories and the programming you do based on like, the quote unquote weakest link within someone's lift, if you will?
Yeah, so there's two different ways to approach that. One is by the main module, the main thing you'd modify would be load, right? So if the if the load at the sticking point forces you into those weird movement patterns, can I back you off just to the edge? Can I reduce that load so you're just at the edge of being able to be successful with correcting your technique and then building through that, right? Maybe I add some heavy isometrics into that same range. But it also could be, if especially if it's happening right off the floor, it might be more of an issue of setting up the deadlift, right? We see this a lot also happening at the lockout. People are, fine off the floor, but you actually look at their technique off the floor, and it's not very efficient. So they end up out of position, and then by the time they get to the lockout, they're in a weird spot where they can't really wedge themselves through because they've lost that tension. Bad start, bad finish kind of thing. You can modify the load, allowing the person to be successful and then slowly progress the load through the sticking point, or you can address technique or position faults on either side of the sticking point and train through those, usually accumulating a crap ton of reps, and maybe even, I don't want to say over cueing, but really focusing on the position right before and right after the sticking point. And that with the deadlift in particular, because you have to generate all of your tension off the floor. Like you can't use the eccentric of a squat or like you can on the squat or the bench press where that weight pushes you down into the bottom of the rep. You don't get that with the deadlift. So you really, really have to focus on wedging yourself down into that position, locking it into place. And you should feel almost like a spring is winding before you even initiate the pull. And so if you lose that sensation at all, okay, that's going to be where I'd spend the most time working.
Yeah, yeah. I think Greg initially told me that the bottom part of the deadlift should be a little uncomfortable. Like you should feel an
A little.
uncomfortable amount of
Yeah.
tension build.
Yes.
And it's just interesting to people the first time they kind of get into it. And it was interesting for myself because I deadlifted before, but I hadn't really felt uncomfortable engagement of a lot of different muscles at the bottom before. Then once you do, it's like, oh, so that's what it's supposed to feel like. It's like a light bulb
Yeah.
moment.
Yep.
It's interesting. I thought for sure you were going to bring up pause deadlifts at some point here, Justin.
I don't care about pause deadlifts.
I don't either. I've heard that from so many people that the pause to deadlift is very, very, very overhyped.
Yeah, I think if I'm going to pause it anywhere, it's going to be right before it touches the ground on the way down, just to own the eccentric, right? Because too many people drop their deadlifts for one thing, right? Yeah, did the work to get it up there. Eccentrics are effective training. We know this. So why not control your eccentric and then get more out of the lift? Like that's just kind of a no-brainer. Like you do not need to be so specific, right? Because powerlifters are all about specificity. Well, I'm only training one rep. It's like, oh, so you're only doing singles your whole training cycle? Give me a break. Or I'm never doing touch and go because I never do touch it. Deadlift is from a dead stop every time. It's like, all right, well, you're gonna fatigue during your brace and you might not get as much volume pulling through the full pattern. Okay, you're kind of cutting off your nose to spite your face with some of those. That doesn't mean you need to train touch and go every single time. It doesn't mean you need to slam the weight down and bounce it back up. But controlling that eccentric and pausing it right before you hit the ground. There's a great video. I think it was Kaz. He was red lighted for lowering a deadlift too fast or something like that in competition. And on the next rep, he locks it out. And he just does this nice long eccentric, just mean mugging the judge the whole time and like sets it down quietly. You see this glare on his face. It's hilarious, but have that energy, like that I think is worthwhile. Like pause deadlifts by themselves, overrated.
Yeah. I think that, having that continuous flow of movement through the concentric is really important. and losing that momentum halfway up just makes the lift exponentially harder for minimal to no benefit or gain.
Yeah, do partials or do isometrics
Mm-hmm.
instead. If you're saying like, hey, I pause deadlifts because I want to own this part of the range of motion, it's like do an isometric there and do it in such a way where you are generating more force than that bar needs to move. Right.
Yeah.
So you're pulling against pins in the rack. Chico was doing this forever ago. A bunch of people have been doing it recently too. I think Bill March was doing it back in the past. Like there's if you strain against an immovable object, you're going to generate more tension right there. And that's going to train that sticking point better than stopping and then not finishing the move. Like that is a movement pattern you are training. Like if you're trying to train strength in a certain range, use an isometric. It's good for about 10 degrees on either side of that position. Train it hard and heavy, then go back to your full range of motion stuff. And if you're the only people doing pause deadlifts are powerlifters, right? And that deadlift becomes sport specific, not just general, not just GPP, right? It is sport specific. So train the deadlift as though it is skill work for your sport, and don't introduce things like the pause that can interfere with stuff. I think that's just gross. Isometrics will get you the training effect that you need there, or
Yeah,
partials.
I completely agree. I'm all in on the ISOs here. And it sounds like you're in on ISOs for other exercise variations as well to assist with the deadlift. You mentioned things like the side plank earlier, which tends to be a bit of a prolonged ISO hold. And I think it's important to kind of bring those things back into the picture because a lot of times, we get so hyper focused or hyper fixated on barbell, 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 or hey, barbell and like one or two machines. We kind of forget about our own body as well as a tool to train. And I think that that's absolutely essential, especially to hit those same muscle groups, but maybe in a slightly different plane of motion than we're normally training, or just get a slightly different stimulus through them because the deadlift itself is a very compressive type lift, which there's nothing wrong with, but I don't want to just constantly compress our body system over and over again. To a certain standpoint, I need a little bit of a expansive stimulus as well.
Yeah, and you can. I touched on this for forearm stuff the other day too, but I can get, if we think about the motion of the spine, right? Extension, we have the joints and the muscles on both sides working in unison to extend the back. Flexion, the muscles on the front are pulling together to come forward. If I'm side bending or rotating, I'm using those same muscles. I'm only using one side of them, right? So I can train a side plank and I can do it heavy. Maybe I even do a side bend off of 45-degree hyper, right? Or off of a GHD. Maybe I do that isometrically. Maybe I go through a range of motion. Just, that's a potential. I've done it before and I loved it. But when I'm training unilaterally, that allows me to use that side to side motion, especially if I have a patient who can't tolerate moving forward and back, right? I can use those isometrics to either side, decrease threat in those circumstances. They're less likely to get some pain or, less likely to have a negative reaction to that training, but I can still get a good training stimulus to the same muscles and the same joints that are going to be helping us with that hinge later on in the program. So yeah, it's a good way to get extra volume without the fatigue that sometimes comes up with repetitive heavy lifts. Like you have to respect the fatigue that comes up with these. And that's another point I would make in a rehab or a coaching setting. As you're training people up and you're going through a bunch of different sets, you're cueing them and all this other stuff, at some point they're going to get tired, right? And stuff is going to start looking sloppy and they're going to stop responding to cues. And you have to make a choice as a coach or as a PT or as a trainer or whatever to say like, okay, we're not making good progress here. I'm just going to be confusing you more because you're tired if I keep trying to coach this too hard. Like choose your battles and remember, you don't have to do everything in the first session, right? Plant some seeds, get 1 to 2 good cues, get what you want out of it. Give them something that they can be successful at outside of your office, right? Because if they need you to cue every single little piece of every single little movement that they do, they cannot be successful with that independently, and they're not going to be able to train it without you, and you have caused harm.
We've talked about the cueing on multiple episodes lately, and it's like, sometimes the best cue is just lift the freaking thing.
Yeah, stand up, grab the bar, stand up.
Yep, just do that. And if they can do that well, then your job's done. I think this is a mistake we've all made at one point or another. we just have a tendency to over cue or want to overcorrect things or, show how much we know. But sometimes the less we do, the better off we are.
Yes. And I think some of that also comes about from some of the educational materials that are out there. They are designed to present, PTs or trainers or coaches with all of the different ways that you can coach somebody on something. Here's a bunch of different cues that are effective. And then the coach or, the person who takes that class goes and uses all of them, right? Your patient or your client doesn't need that. They just need enough to be successful. So let them self-organize, let them figure out how they need to do it based on the constraints that they have. And then you just facilitate, you just provide little bits of guidance along the way. You don't have to do all the work for them. Let them figure stuff out.
Yep, exactly. And understanding the timeline for all of this as well, right? Like you don't magically just get really good at the deadlift in 6 weeks. It'd be great if you did,
Correct.
but you mentioned about past training history here as well. Like there are individuals I've seen who have not really trained the deadlift and they get pretty good pretty quick, but they might have grew up on a farm or blue collar type of
Sure.
setting where, they're used to lifting heavy stuff over and over and over again off the ground. So there's a little bit of an advantage there. So understanding that everyone has a different starting point for the deadlift and the progression is going to look drastically differently as a result. I will say that from what I'm hearing from people, especially in the powerlifting side, they really prioritize the deadlift because, a 10% jump on your deadlift could mean 70, 80 pounds more
Mm-hmm.
in your total. Whereas a
Yep.
10% jump in your bench might mean about half of that. So really prioritizing this lift, regardless of what your walk of life is, and understanding that the progression is going to look different for everyone is essential as well.
Yeah. And just also recognizing like the deadlift doesn't have to be a scary lift, right? We pick things up off the ground all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a ton of different ways to do that. But if I can build confidence in somebody's ability to do that, then that's going to open doors for them elsewhere, whether that's in competitive sports, whether that's just in, day-to-day life stuff, whether that's picking up their grandkids or whatever else. A lot of good things can come from it. The other piece that there are a lot more people out there that are comfortable training the bench press or the squat than they are the deadlift, because the deadlift has some stigmas around injury or whatever else that are largely unfounded. But for me personally, like the squat and the bench press are a lot scarier, because if I miss a lift, I am between that bar and the floor, and I'm going to get stapled. And I have seen some serious injuries happen with that. I've had some issues myself with that happening. The deadlift, something goes wrong, I let go. Oh no, and I'm out of the way. Right? I let go and I'm fine. So it's like from a mental standpoint, like my own safety is almost never a concern. If I'm benching heavy, like if I'm nearing a max lift on my bench, even in a rack with safeties, like I have to ramp myself up. It's like, all right, I can do this and I'm not going to die. Deadlift, that never enters my head, because I can just let go. It's going to be fine.
Yeah, and I might edit this part out, but when I injured my back deadlifting last summer, I found that the spine has a tendency, as long as you don't like fracture it, it tends to heal. Like I had
Yeah.
gnarly neural tension and all kinds of different things, but it got better with the
Hmm.
bench because I also had a incident where I messed up my pec a little bit. Tendons don't magically regenerate themselves.
Nope.
So, if you tear a tendon benching, you need surgery. But, back injury, deadlifting, in 4 to 6 weeks, I felt like a whole new person. So
Yeah.
just understanding that, like, it might be an injury type stereotype there, but the type of injury is drastically different, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think the back is way more robust than people give it credit for. If you've ever had a chance to go to Body Worlds or to do some dissection, like there is just so much tissue. It is incredible how much meat is back there. And the way it's all layered and structured together, it's honestly just gorgeous. Like if you can look at the multifidus in a fresh cadaver, it's gorgeous, right? It's like this braided opalescent rope of meat. It's as big around as your wrist in some cases, sitting right up against the spine. Like that's amazing. Then you get into the other layers into the thoracolumbar fascia. And it's just there's some robust structures back there. and they respond very well to training. Obviously, you want to be intelligent about it, right? You want to make sure that you're training progressively, that you've prepared for the loads that you're handling, and you don't just go in and do a bunch of stupid crap. But there is so much potential in our bodies to be able to handle these kind of movements. The deadlift checks so many boxes to give us that training stimulus and to increase function, increase sport performance. Like, I could spend another hour just soapboxing about why the deadlift is awesome, but I won't.
Yeah, we could definitely go on and on about this, but you know, I really appreciate your time and the insights that you've offered on the deadlift here today, Justin. For people who want to find out more about you, I know you keep a, you know, booming online presence that way. Where can they find you at?
Yeah, no, I'm like, probably the best way is my Instagram profile is deadlift therapy. Deadlift is my therapy. It's not like I'm a deadlift therapist per se, but that's where that comes from. But and then I'm on LinkedIn as well, but for anybody who wants to make professional connections that way. But otherwise, like, I don't really like have a brand. I don't really like sell coaching service or anything like that. I'm really just kind of a nerd about deadlifting and, you know, doing PT and doing cool stuff and trying to have fun lifting rocks sometimes.
That's the way to do it, man. We will link to
Yeah.
that in the description below. I really appreciate your time and your continued insights and everything that you do to kind of help mold the next generation there of PT and SNC.
Yeah. Thanks, Dan. I appreciate all the good stuff that you're doing for the field too. Good talking with you.